Chapter 3, Part 2, the continuation of the discussions regarding our personal adult ego behavioural patterns. We also have a very few other historical figures that can be found throughout mankind's history that were highly influenced throughout their very early childhoods with mankind's more advanced, highly evolved altruistic emotions, even though they too developed their own set of different, determined ego emotions. However, these advanced altruistic emotions help them to develop dominant behaviours of the collective consciousness for alternative, positive and peaceful humanitarian reasons, such as the teachings of Martin Luther King Jr., the American civil rights activist, and Mahatma Gandhi, an Indian lawyer and anti-colonial nationalist who employed non-violent resistance to lead the successful campaign for India's independence from British rule and in turn inspired movements for civil rights and freedom across the world. And Nelson Mandela, whose government focused on dismantling the legacy of apartheid by tackling institutionalised racism and fostering racial reconciliation. And St. Francis of Assisi in 1228, who was known as the patron saint of animals and ecology. And throughout our human history, some of our greatest gurus have tried to teach us how we can all find the solutions to receive enlightenment. But these teachings have mostly become lost in translation, simply because we didn't understand enough about our different human emotions and behaviours. For instance, the most famous of all great gurus, Buddha, also known as Siddhartha Gautama or Siddhartha Gautama, who was born around the 5th century BC, but spent most of his early childhood isolated and protected by his loving aristocratic family. And once he reached adulthood, he was also blessed with a loving wife and child. But his protective family would not allow him to set foot outside of the palace grounds, so that he wouldn't witness all of the poverty and suffering outside in the villages in present-day Nepal. Until one day, in early adulthood, he finds his own way out of the palace, and he begins to discover the reality of the outside world, with all of the poverty and human suffering. He vows that he would not set back into the palace until he has discovered the solutions to release all human suffering. And so he sets out on a lifetime's quest, and this quest eventually leads him to sit under the Bodhi tree, to spend many thousands of hours and many years searching for these answers. But he believed that to find these answers, he must go through the same amount of suffering, and so he spends many years alone, isolated and in poverty, with malnutrition and starving himself to find these answers of suffering. But while he spends all of these thousands of hours in isolation, peace and silence, in his own thought patterns, he is confronted with his own set of ego demons, his own set of ego emotions that try to tempt him, to make him remain in these extreme ego emotional wounds and suffering. And so he begins to experience all sorts of ego emotional temptations, such as lust for women and sexual desires, ego temptations of desires for money and wealth, ego temptations of hate, revenge, jealousy, pride, fear, hurt, and many other temptations found through his own set of ego emotions stored in his long-term memory. But Buddha became the enlightened one, simply because, while he remained still under the Bodhi tree for many thousands of hours and many years, he began to understand that all of these demons were, in fact, his own set of ego emotional wounds and suffering, trying very hard to rise to the surface in his long-term memory. And this is why, once he had this enlightened moment, he then began to revert back to his more dominant, early childhood, highly evolved, altruistic emotions, such as empathy, compassion, loving kindness, happiness, and peace, and generosity of his human spirit for all others, and all sentient beings. Because as a young child, he had been largely isolated from the outside world of suffering, and so this isolation meant that he had been given the gifts and blessings of developing throughout his early childhood his own set of highly evolved altruistic emotions to become more dominantly stored in his long-term memory. And only once he became a young adult and entered into the outside world to experience the real realities of life did he begin to develop more dominantly his own ego emotional wounds and suffering. Through spending many years alone in Nepal in poverty, and also witnessing such poverty and human suffering of many others he met throughout his journeys. However, once Buddha had received this blessing of this enlightened moment, he then spent many thousands of hours in peace and silence, sitting under the Bodhi tree to release and heal himself from his own set of ego emotions. And once he achieved success, he reverted back to his more dominant early childhood, highly evolved altruistic emotions stored in his long-term memory. And this is when he began his true path towards samsara, and finally enlightenment that he describes as a state of nirvana. But because he was now functioning more dominantly with the emotions of the collective consciousness, Buddha then spent the rest of his life teaching and spreading these messages to all others over all of the villages of Nepal. This is why the true path to enlightenment gets lost in translation when we begin to discuss all of our different religious beliefs. This is why I do not follow any kind of religions, simply because I don't want any excuse for my own ego-competitive behaviours to take over control in my long-term memory and begin to ego powers with any other person's different religious beliefs. However, although it takes a lifetime to practice to become fully developed in our long-term memories with our advanced, highly evolved altruistic emotions, it is my firm belief that the ultimate level of human existence that any one person can ever experience in any one person's lifetime doesn't stop here, because the ultimate level of existence goes beyond enlightenment, and it is when we are able to receive some of the greatest gifts and miracles that all of mankind has tried to find for thousands of years. And this is why this ultimate and third level of existence, level 3, is going to be discussed in the final chapters of this book. Sleep disturbance is another very good example of how our own set of individual, illogical, irrational, ego, fear or hurt emotions can sometimes take over control in our long-term memories. We can toss and turn for hours at night trying to get to sleep. This is a clear indication that our now dominant ego emotions have now taken over control in our long-term memories and are controlling all of our positive and peaceful, logical and rational emotions and thought patterns stored in our long-term memories. Because in a normal situation, when we are tired and relaxed at night, our long-term memories begin to shut down, because it takes a huge amount of effort for our long-term memories to keep making all of our different daily functions when we are awake. Therefore, our long-term memories are exhausted and need time to sleep at night to shut down our brains and bodies in order to recharge. This is why sleep is needed when our brains are desperately tired, because of the long, hard working day and all of the physical and mental actions that our brains and bodies have gone through. Remember that our brains make all of the decisions for most of our bodily functions. Our behaviours, our thought patterns, our decisions, our reasoning, our reactions, and most of our physical actions and movements. And this is very exhausting for our brains, with billions of neurons being fired up to make all of these physical and mental actions and decisions throughout our daily lives. This is why our long-term memories need to first shut down before our bodies can shut down, because most of our bodily functions we are making throughout our days, whenever we are awake, is controlled by the information that is stored and recalled from our long-term memories. Therefore, at the end of our long and hard-working day, our brains' long-term memories are extremely tired. However, in extreme circumstances, when we have experienced some very difficult emotional events throughout our day, all of our different ego emotions can sometimes rise to the surface and take over control in our long-term memories. But remember that this can be for many hundreds of different reasons, such as too much anger, too much fear, too much hurt, too much stress, anxieties, too much distrust, or any other different ego emotional wounds or suffering. Our ego emotions take over control in our long-term memories because they have now taken over control of all logical and rational emotions and all logical and rational thought patterns stored in our long-term memories. And at this stage, our out-of-control ego emotions are no longer calm and relaxed, and all decisions on what time we will get to sleep has now become the authority of our dominant and out-of-control ego emotions. To test what degree of strength you have developed and stored your own individual and different illogical, irrational, ego, fear or hurt emotions into your long-term memory, you only have to ask yourself this following very simple question. Have you ever in your life been in a situation when some drastic emotional event happened, and at that same night you were so tired and exhausted that you tried really hard to get to sleep, but you couldn't? You tossed and turned in your bed for hours, and the more you tried, the more you failed to get to sleep, and eventually you had to get up, go downstairs and make yourself a hot drink or a sandwich, read a book, play on your smartphone or watch TV, etc. This is because at this stage your own individual, illogical, irrational, ego, fear or hurt emotions have now taken over control in your long-term memory, and therefore have now taken over control of all of your logical and rational emotions and thought patterns stored in your long-term memory. This is why sleep disturbance is just a simple test of how all of our different very early childhood, illogical, irrational, ego, fear or hurt emotions sometimes rise to the surface and take over control in our long-term memories. And the same happens whenever we are interacting with other ego emotions, and when our upset, angry, hurt, hate, distrustful, in fear, or any other different ego emotional wounds or suffering begin to rise to the surface and take over control in our long-term memories. This is why we should never ever underestimate the power, control and strength of our own set of individual and different adult ego, fear or hurt emotional behavioural patterns. However, please remember that we are all very different. Therefore, we have all developed very different ego, fear or hurt emotions, and in all different degrees of strength, depending on the degree of strength of our own individual emotional events that have become stored into our long-term memories since our very early childhoods. We mustn't forget also that now we have all experienced this very recent pandemic. This pandemic has also caused many of us to rapidly increase many of our different ego, fear or hurt emotions to become dominantly stored into our long-term memories through listening to daily fear-based media news on our TVs and on social media, and through all of our different fear-based conversations with each other related to all of these different health or financial issues. But it doesn't simply stop with the pandemic, because we all know that there are now new ego fears that are based on these new war issues, and new ego fears that concern the cost of our food, fuel and heating our homes, etc., paying our rent and mortgages, health issues, the list is endless. All of these issues are now creating even more ego, fear or hurt emotions to become stored into our long-term memories. This is the reason that we are all very different, and we have all developed very different ego, fear or hurt emotions, and in all different degrees of strength, some mild, some dominant, and some extreme adult ego, fear or hurt emotions. This is the reason that at the end of this chapter you will find a long list of these different ego emotions and ego behavioural patterns. However, please be aware that there is no particular order of importance throughout this list, and because there are now nearly 8 billion plus people living on our fragile planet Earth today, each person has developed and stored into their long-term memories their very own individual and very different, very early childhood, illogical, irrational, ego, fear or hurt emotions, and in all different degrees of strength that most of us were unaware of. This is why it will be up to you to be wise, brave and courageous enough to make your own personal reflections on what are your own different and individual ego, fear or hurt emotions, and in what degree of strength you have developed and behave with them in your own individual and different adult ego behavioural patterns, in your own everyday, daily adult life. We have already briefly discussed how money is at the root of all evil, and that most of us are now slaves to money, because we all spend our lives chasing money. But in extreme circumstances, extreme ego greed for money can sometimes even take over control in our long-term memories, so extreme in fact that some individuals begin to plot and scheme with some not so welcome ego greed behaviours, some ego malicious ways to cheat money out of others. A good example of extreme ego greed for money is family inheritance that can cause huge animosities, hate and hurt between family members. For instance, when there is favouritism in a family unit and one of the favourite siblings begins to plot malicious ways to take over control of the family's inheritance, this is when extreme ego greed has now taken over control in the long-term memory to now become a sickness in the long-term memory. But this doesn't have to relate simply to money issues. It can also be for many other different reasons, such as many different strong political, social, cultural or religious opinions and beliefs, or even, in extreme circumstances, the support of our different favourite sports teams. A small example of this can be found in an old movie called Love Divided, made in 1999, that is based on a true story about a newly married couple in Ireland in the late 1950s, who both, husband and wife, practiced two different religions. And once the local village people found out that the couple had married, the two different religions began to trigger some extreme ego-competitive, ego-aggressive behaviours with each other that began to rise to the surface in their long-term memories, that became so extreme that they took over control of all logical and rational emotions stored in the long-term memories. to trigger and activate some of mankind's ancient ancestors' primitive genetic emotions and behaviours that are stored in the genetic memory that quickly turned into extreme physical, aggressive and violent actions with each other. Another example of this can be found in another old movie called Torn Apart that was made in 1989, an epic love story that is not a true story, however, but it is set against the backdrop of the Middle East turmoil and is another example of different conflicts that are caused through our different religious beliefs. Please be aware, however, that it will be much easier for you to understand how we, as humans, have been able to activate some of our ancient ancestors' more aggressive genetic emotions once we complete the next few chapters of this book. But it's not only our different religious beliefs that feed, drive, control, and increase all of our different ego behavioural patterns. Every single one of us grew up in a different country of origin, and each country has their own individual and different cultural beliefs and traditions. And many of these cultural beliefs are based on many of our ancestors' past history of emotional events. For instance, what conflicts or wars our ancestors fought with each other. And all of these different conflict stories throughout our human history we pass on to our children from generation to the next. And this is how each generation continues to build ego distrust for other people that come from these different countries. And this ego distrust can sometimes become so extreme that it can even develop into ego racism or ego animosities or ego hate for other people from that country. I have personally experienced racism myself, and it was understandable because many years ago my own country of origin invaded the country that I now reside, and through this colonialism, this caused a great deal of human suffering. However, this extreme colonial ego aggression happened in past history, but by teaching children to hate people from past history is how all of our different cultural beliefs continue to feed, drive, control and increase all of our different ego behavioural patterns to become dominantly stored into our long-term memories. Remember that whatever becomes stored into our long-term memories remains in our long-term memories and becomes our adult ego behavioural patterns, our ego thought patterns, our ego reasoning, our ego decisions, and most of our ego reactions. There are many examples throughout our human history that extreme ego greed behaviours have been used simply to gain some particular country's resources. We all know this because this is how most wars begin throughout our human history. But throughout the centuries, this has caused huge amounts of generational suffering and is how most individual countries still continue to remain fractured and separated from each other, because we have not yet found alternative solutions to collectively live and survive together in global collective peace, happiness, harmony with each other. This is the reason that it is my firm belief that this will only be achieved once we all find the practical solutions to function dominantly in our long-term memories with our highly evolved altruistic emotions and behaviours of the collective consciousness. A very good example of colonial aggression can be found in an old film that will be referenced in the index for this chapter. Also, all of our individual countries' cultural traditions and cultural beliefs can sometimes cause a great deal of social unrest. For instance, a country that has a corrupt government and that demands high taxes from his people, or high prices for fuel, food, etc., and takes these profits and gives them to the government people and not to the country's people, so that the people begin to suffer and have no money to eat, stay warm and survive. And this is when many underprivileged and desperate people sometimes have to relocate to other countries in search of solutions to find money in order to survive. And this is when these vulnerable and underprivileged people start to get exploited in these new countries as cheap labour or sometimes even slave labour. I have also personally witnessed the exploitation of many underprivileged and vulnerable people that are used as cheap labour, even slave labour, working 12-hour shifts with no days off and very small salaries, and all of these people were exploited by the extreme ego greed of bosses whose main concern was simply to make financial profits for themselves. And there was nothing that I could do to prevent this suffering to many of these underprivileged and vulnerable people. I have also witnessed many underprivileged people being forced to leave their overpopulated countries for no other reason but desperation for money. So much human suffering that still my heart cries for all of these vulnerable people. But now, social unrest is becoming more and more extreme, and many more people are now trying to relocate to other countries in search of money to survive. This is the reason that all financial, economic, even many of our different religious, political, social, cultural, and even the support of our favourite sports teams all feed, drive, control, and increase all of our different ego, emotional wounds and suffering. And because we now have huge increases in overpopulation, this is the reason that our ego behavioural patterns are also continuing to increase throughout our modern world today. And it will continue to do so until we find alternative solutions to live and survive together in collective peace, happiness and harmony with each other. And this is why it's my firm belief that the alternative solutions to all of this generational suffering can only be achieved once we all discover the practical solutions to become dominantly stored in our long-term memories with our advanced altruistic emotions and behaviours of the collective consciousness. Imagine now that you are at a football match, supporting your favourite football team. Imagine at the end of this match that the opposition's football team won the game. How did it make you feel? At this stage, we sometimes can be extremely upset or angry that our team didn't win the match. This is when many of our ego emotions can begin to rise to the surface of our long-term memories. We cannot help this because these are some of our ego competitive behaviours, all of our ego emotions of disappointment, even anger that our team lost the match. These are mild and not so serious ego emotions. But sometimes when some individuals who have developed extreme ego competitive behaviours become so extreme that they take over control in the long-term memory, this is when, in extreme circumstances, these extreme ego emotions trigger some of mankind's more serious ancient ancestors' primitive genetic emotions that then activates physical aggression and violent actions with some of the opposition's football fans. This is because all extreme ego competitive behaviours are now out of control of all logical and all rational behaviours stored in the long-term memory. And on a very few occasions, this is when football fans have been known to even cause riots at the end of football matches. This is another small example of many different reasons that can trigger some of mankind's extreme ego-driven behavioural patterns to take over control in our long-term memories. This is why we should never, ever underestimate the power, control and strength of our own set of unknown, different, individual, illogical, irrational, ego, fear or hurt emotions, because only in extreme circumstances, when we get extremely competitive, upset, angry, hurt, hate, in fear, stressed, anxious, distrustful, or having any other different extreme ego emotional wounds or suffering, can these extreme ego emotions take over control in our long-term memories to activate some of our more serious ancient ancestors' primitive, aggressive genetic emotions that are found in our genetic memory. We all have this genetic memory, including myself, and this is why we are going to discuss some of these more serious of mankind's genetic emotions in much more detail in the next few chapters. However, there is one main cause that brings a great deal of impetus and that motivates and exacerbates many of these different adult ego, fear or hurt emotions to become increasingly activated, and this is the power of speech. Because most of us now use the power of speech and language to communicate with each other in our everyday, daily lives. But throughout thousands of years, speech has slowly evolved the development in certain areas in our brain. And this has occurred because of an evolutionary process that science experts refer to as adaptation through evolution. This is how speech has separated us humans from all other sentient beings, all creatures, all animals, and all that belongs to Earth's nature, here on our vulnerable yet fragile planet Earth. But it has taken neuroscience experts many years to distinguish which areas in our brain have evolved us to develop the power of speech. Apparently, most of the production depends critically on the integrity of the motor cortex, that is the region of the cerebral cortex involved in planning, control, and execution of voluntary movements. However, we must not forget that whatever is stored in our long-term memories becomes our thought patterns, and it is only our thought patterns that give us the capacity to express ourselves through the power of speech. And because we now have huge increases in overpopulation, very often the power of speech has now become a massive hindrance for many of us, for many different reasons, and is now working to our detriment, because speech develops and accumulates many of our different ego, fear or hurt emotions to become increasingly active and increasingly developed and stored into our long-term memories. Because sometimes speech is not for the benefit of our own positive and peaceful, progressive journey of self-development. Because speech allows us to express all of these different ego fears, ego anger, ego hurt, ego hate, ego stress, ego anxieties, ego distrust, ego jealousy, and all different kinds of ego emotional wounds and suffering to each other and from each other. And by doing so, speech allows us to continue to accumulate, through the help of neuroplasticity, even more of these different ego emotional wounds and suffering to become stored into our long-term memories. This is how, by the time we all get to become adults, we have all developed, accumulated and stored into our long-term memories our own set of different adult ego behavioural patterns. This is how speech can become a huge disability and a severe drawback, especially in our current difficult emotional climate today, and especially because most of us are speaking different languages, and if we don't understand a particular language, we cannot explain clearly or understand each other, and so all of our different languages are also a huge hindrance to our human evolutionary development, because if we cannot speak to each other clearly, many of these different languages that are spoken in many different countries separates the people in this particular country from all other countries' languages, and therefore we are maintaining separation within the global world population and allowing for more ego distrust and ego fears with each other to continue to develop. This is the reason that we need to develop one specific language that will be spoken and understood by all people in all countries all over the world. Of course, speech would be a very welcome method of communication if humanity had never created any of our different ego emotions, because speech also allows us the ability to express to each other many of our logical and rational and sometimes even our highly evolved altruistic emotions to each other, such as our love, affection and positive, happy, compassionate and loving kind emotions to each other, and generosity of our human spirit towards each other, or to show how we feel, think and how to praise and reward each other. Speech also allows us to communicate to each other different positive innovations and advances for mankind's positive future progression, and even allows us to make intelligent or happy conversations with each other, or even to laugh, have fun and even enjoy others' company. This is why it's advisable to spend as much time listening, watching and talking only to positive, happy and peaceful people, either through face-to-face interactions or interacting with positive and peaceful TV, positive and peaceful movies, positive and peaceful computer games, positive and peaceful social media, positive and peaceful smartphone interactions, positive and peaceful books, radio or any other interactions on digital devices, and all face-to-face interactions and communications with each other. However, most of us are well aware that sometimes this is not possible for us to do, but it would be very advisable for us all to try really hard to shut down on all different difficult fear-based interactions, simply because whatever different difficult fear-based interactions and events we are listening to or interacting with through the power of speech can trigger a response from our own set of different ego emotions. And once this happens, neuroplasticity involuntarily develops this new ego emotion to become stored into our long-term memories. But some of the most serious of all ego emotional interactions that most of us are currently unaware of, but can sometimes develop into some very serious and very extreme ego emotions to become dominantly stored into a young child or young teenager's long-term memory, can develop through playing and interacting with fear-based, aggressive, even violent computer games, especially many different war games, guns, tanks, monsters, all sorts of fear or aggressive computer games. There are now an entire selection of different computer games available for young children and teenagers, even adults. So how can some of these fear-based, aggressive, even violent computer games develop into extreme, aggressive ego emotions that have become stored into our long-term memories? Computer games need our 100% focused attention and concentration in order to play to try to win the game. And this is how, when focusing with complete attention for such long periods of time, we can begin to trigger many of our different ego-aggressive or ego-fear-based emotions to become activated, and that rises to the surface in the long-term memory. Because when we are playing a computer game, any computer game, we have absolutely no other focus other than our focused attention on that particular computer game. And while we are listening, watching, playing, and emotionally interacting and reacting for many hours each day and sometimes for months, we are triggering all of these ego-aggressive or ego-fear-based emotions to become stored into our long-term memories. We are not even aware of this, and although computer games are not real-world emotional events, but fictitious emotional events played on a computer game, as mentioned earlier, our long-term memories does not recognise the difference between the development of real emotions and fictitious emotions played on these computer games, because our long-term memories simply stores information, but whatever we are storing into our long-term memories is only what we are able to recall and react with. This is how these fictitious ego-emotional interactions and events, played through thousands of hours of different aggressive and sometimes violent computer games, can sometimes become dominantly stored into a young boy's long-term memory through this natural process in our brains called neuroplasticity. And this is much more serious for young children because, as we have already mentioned earlier, children's brains are much more malleable, in other words, much more easily able to pick up, absorb and store emotional information into the long-term memory, just like a sponge, without even trying, much easier than most adults can. This is why, if a young child or young teenager spends hours and hours and many months playing on any kind of fear-based, aggressive, or even violent computer game, their long-term memories can sometimes become obsessed or indoctrinated. So why is this very serious? As we have already mentioned many times earlier, the definition of a memory, any memory, is the power or process of recalling what has been previously learnt or experienced. And this is when situations can get even more serious, because in extreme circumstances, these extreme ego emotions can become so out of control in the long-term memory that they take over control of the long-term memory and can even activate some of mankind's more primitive, aggressive, or even violent genetic emotions that can be found stored in another area in our brain that holds our genetic memory. This is when, in extreme circumstances, we have even witnessed in the news tragic incidences of young boys or young teenagers entering into schools and shooting their classmates and teachers. Remember that this only happens after hundreds of hours and many months of playing aggressive or violent computer games, when a young child or young teenager's long-term memory can no longer recognise the difference between real-world emotional events and these fictitious emotional events played after thousands of hours and many months of these aggressive or violent computer games. Remember that our brain's long-term memory is simply a memory that stores whatever information it is given and can only recall, behave, think, make decisions and react with whatever information has been previously stored into our long-term memory. So what can we all do today to prevent ourselves from being triggered, fired up and activated by many of our own different adult ego behavioural patterns? These are not permanent solutions, but will help prevent us all from activating any further increases in our own set of different ego, fear or hurt emotions that have become stored into our long-term memories. Therefore, each time that you feel that you are getting upset, angry, feel hurt, hate, stressed, distrustful, or reacting with any other of your other different ego emotional wounds or suffering that are now rising to the surface in your long-term memory. And remember that this could be for hundreds of different difficult personal and individual emotional reasons. Before you react, try really hard to become aware of your own ego emotions. And instead of reacting, stop, step back, and walk away from all difficult ego power struggles through any different difficult face-to-face interactions, conflicts, arguments, anger, aggression, all interactions that you feel are causing you ego emotional wounds or suffering to rise to the surface in your long-term memory. By doing this, you release yourself from the strong grip and control of your own ego behavioural patterns. In other words, whenever someone says or does something to get you angry, upset, or you feel that any of your ego, fear or hurt emotions are becoming triggered from any different difficult reasons, acknowledge that it is only your ego, fear or hurt emotions that are now trying very hard to take over control in your long-term memory. And by doing this, you will stop adding more of these similar ego emotions to get stored into your long-term memory. At the same time, you can repeat to yourself the following sentence. I am well aware that my ego emotions are now trying to take over control in my long-term memory, and I now choose to take back control in my long-term memory and to reinstate instead only positive, happy, altruistic, compassionate, kind, joyful, grateful and peaceful emotions to become stored into my long-term memory. At first, it is extremely difficult to make these changes because our ego pride or ego fear or ego hurt emotions, etc., want us to react. Pride is a very controlling, strong and dominant ego emotion that really wants to defend our own honour, because it has been defending our own honour ever since our very young, very early childhood years. Therefore, pride tries really hard to keep us stuck in our ego emotions, because when someone humiliates us, hurts our feelings, makes us upset or angry, or is aggressive towards us, or we are having any other fearful, distrusting, difficult, face-to-face, ego emotional interactions, all we want to do is lash out and defend ourselves, defend our own honour, because we are using our own set of ego, fear or hurt survival emotions to do this. And by reacting and activating our ego emotions, however, we are simply adding even more ego, fear or hurt emotions to become stored into our long-term memories. In these particular circumstances, one of the easiest solutions to prevent this happening is to stop very difficult face-to-face interactions and difficult communications with difficult people. Stop watching fear-based TV media news. Stop interacting on all different kinds of fear-based social media. Stop watching fear-based movies, fear-based smartphone and messaging, fear-based computer games, fear-based books, fear-based media in newspapers, magazines, all different fear-based interactions that will easily trigger all of our different ego, fear or hurt emotions to rise to the surface in our long-term memory and become activated. And this can also happen whenever we are shopping, for instance, or travelling, or interacting with our family members, work colleagues, governments, banking, money issues, legal issues, health issues, husbands or wives, children, parents, brothers or sisters, all sorts of reasons. Instead of reacting with our own set of ego, fear or hurt emotions, stop, step back and walk away from all difficult ego power struggles and different difficult ego, fear or hurt interactions. Preventing our ego, fear or hurt emotions from taking over control in our long-term memories by stopping and stepping back from any difficult persons, situations or events whenever another person is trying to push our so-called ego emotional buttons is not an easy thing to do, but I can assure you that it gets much easier with time and practice. However, don't expect this to happen instantly. As mentioned, our own set of individual ego emotions are much more controlling than we can all ever imagine possible. This is why we should never ever underestimate the power, control and strength of our own set of ego emotions that want to dominate and control all other logical, rational emotions stored in our long-term memories. Whenever we are upset, angry, hurt, or have any other ego emotional wounds or suffering. Have you ever noticed that whenever any of us get a chance to have a few minutes of silence, peace, and quiet in our lives, we start looking for something to do or someone to talk to? We even need the distraction of our smartphones, social media, or any other different digital computer technologies to distract our now overloaded ego emotions stored in our long-term memories. We need this stimulation of noise pollution simply to feed our dominant ego emotions. All sorts of distractions to prevent our long-term memories from being in a place of peace and silence. This is why all of our different ego emotions are now increasing tenfold, because all of this huge selection that we now have at our disposal of these distractions are not needed by you. They are needed by your ego, fear or hurt emotions that have now taken over control in your long-term memory and demanding that you find these distractions, demand that you find noise pollution because they are now controlling your long-term memory. Before we end this chapter, you are going to be provided with a long list of these very different ego emotions and adult ego behavioural patterns. However, please be aware that there is no particular order of importance throughout this list. And because there are now nearly 8 billion plus people living on our fragile planet Earth today, each person has developed and stored into their long-term memories their very own individual and very different ego emotions and adult ego behavioural patterns, all different and in all different degrees of strength, some mild, some dominant, and some individuals have developed extreme ego emotions and behavioural patterns that have taken over control in the long-term memory. This is why it will be up to you to be wise, brave, and courageous enough to make your own personal reflections on what are your own different and individual ego, fear or hurt emotions, and in what degree of strength you have developed and behave with them in your own everyday, daily adult life. List of ego emotions and adult ego behavioural patterns. Fear, hurt, hate, anger, stress, anxiety, distrust, jealousy, pride, envy, revenge, argumentative, malicious gossip, ignorance, arrogance, greed for money, extreme greed for money, extreme greed for power and control, extreme competitive power struggles over others, temptation, obsessive need for consumer buying and spending, gluttony, gossiping, spreading rumours, bitchiness, nosiness, backstabbing, two-faced, heartless, nastiness, ill intentions, false gossip, cruel and unkind thoughts towards others, illogical and irrational thoughts and emotions, verbal aggression, verbal manipulation, verbal intimidation, playing mind games, verbal aggressive threatening behaviours, verbal bullying behaviours, verbal cruelty, verbal anger, verbal hate, verbal abuse, verbal shouting, verbal screaming, verbal aggressive fighting, verbal outrage, short-tempered, over-inflated confidence, over-confident talking, out of control chattering or talking, the need for noise pollution, intimidating others, blaming others, closed-minded, impatience, provoking controversy, contentious behaviours, dishonesty, vengeance, materialism, indoctrination. Leaders' extreme behaviours of greed to conquer other countries in order to obtain Earth's resources for political or financial reasons. Leaders' extreme ego behaviours of ego greed to conquer and retain control over other countries. All aggressive behaviours that take pleasure in causing pain and suffering to others. Journalists' false fear-based lies and scandal behaviours. Journalists' false accusations. Creating fear-based media news. Scandal behaviours. Tyrant behaviours. Spiteful behaviours. Taking pleasure in others' misfortune. Suspicious behaviours. Suspicion of others. Interfering behaviours. Causing fear to others. Causing suffering to others. Bully tactic behaviours to try to gain power and control over others. Pretentious behaviours. Nasty, scheming, trickster behaviours. Tit-for-tat behaviours. Deliberate criticism to try to gain power and control over others. Deliberate blaming to try to gain power and control over others. Taking pleasure in finding ways to blame or convict others. Laziness. Lack of listening. Lack of focus or of attention. Rude and loud behaviours. Temper behaviours. Feeling sorry for self. Taking pleasure in one's own misery. Taking pleasure in complaining to others. Taking pleasure in one's own self-importance. Lack of heightened awareness to others' suffering. Lack of respect for others. Taking pleasure in feeling superior over others, lack of kindness towards others, lack of compassion towards others, threatening abusive behaviours towards others, threatening and verbal abusive behaviours towards others, threatening legal abusive behaviours towards others, taking pleasure in exploiting others, causing fear to others, extreme greed to gain financial profits with no other concerns for the suffering that this causes to others, extreme and out of control moaning and complaining, extreme and out of control hate, extreme and out of control jealousy, extreme and out of control verbal abuse, extreme and out of control greed for money, extreme and out of control malicious gossip, extreme and out of control anger, extreme and out of control aggression, written or verbal threats through peer pressure jealousy, legal threats through peer pressure jealousy, legal or verbal threats to others less wealthy and financially struggling, using monetary wealth to gain power and control over others, acting with extreme snobbery and superiority behaviours over others due to obtaining monetary wealth, finding it hard to get to sleep at night, insomnia, always taking and never giving, lack of generosity of the human spirit, internal chattering of one's own ego emotions, ego temptation of desires for money and wealth, ego temptations of hate, revenge, jealousy, pride, fear, hurt, and many other ego temptations found through our own individual and different ego emotions stored in our long-term memories. Legal threatening behaviours, verbal threatening behaviours, argumentative threatening behaviours, argumentative and aggressive threatening behaviours, arguing, shouting, aggressive argumentative behaviours, anger and aggressive behaviours, all verbal aggressive behaviours, always blaming others, always criticising others, always why questioning others in order to criticise others, authoritative, aggressive, bullying behaviours used to gain superiority over others, ruthless plotting and scheming behaviours deliberately to find ways to hurt others, in other words, sadism, taking pleasure in finding ways to hurt others, in other words, sadism, taking pleasure in creating suffering to others, in other words, sadism, vindictive behaviours. Individuals' extreme ego greed behavioural patterns used to find ways to exploit others more vulnerable and underprivileged simply to gain financial profits. For instance, bosses' exploitation through slave labour, long hours of hard work giving small monetary rewards to staff and all employees. Individuals' extreme ego greed behavioural patterns used to find ways to exploit all vulnerable that belongs to all Earth's nature, simply to gain financial profits, with no concerns for the protection, loving kindness and compassion, and welfare of all vulnerable that belongs to all Earth's nature. Exploiting others for one's own financial benefits, with no concerns for the protection, compassion, loving kindness and welfare of others. Focusing on one's own self-importance, unable to work together in a teamwork environment. Snobbery, using superiority behaviours over others because of one's own superior financial status. Judging others by the status of their finances. Bosses' inability to notice, appreciate and respect the hard work of their employees. Using ego-authoritative boss-type behaviours simply to gain superiority, power and control over others, with no compassion, kindness or heightened awareness towards others' suffering. Bosses' inability to notice, appreciate and respect the dedication of employees' hard work. Bosses' extreme ego bully behaviours used to gain power and control over employees, underprivileged and less developed with ego emotions. Compulsive lying behaviours, also known as pathological lying, mythomania, or habitual lying behaviours. Focusing on one's own self-importance, in other words, narcissism. Focusing on one's own self-importance through vainness or vanity, in other words, narcissism. Snitching, to secretly tell someone in authority that someone has done something wrong in order to cause trouble and hurt other people. Using ego-authoritative bully-type behaviours simply to gain superiority, power and control over others. Using ego-authoritative bully-type behaviours to keep others to remain inferior, with no compassion, kindness or heightened awareness towards others' suffering. Always blaming another in order to hurt another, in other words, sadism. Always criticising another in order to hurt another, in other words, sadism. Betraying others who put their trust in you. Abusive behaviours towards people or animals. Threatening revenge behaviours in order to hurt others. Treating others with inferiority to self. Creating fear-based media news deliberately to increase ego-fear emotions to develop in others. Short attention span behaviours or inability to focus our attention or to concentrate for long periods of time, or inability to listen to others. Ignorance behaviours, inability to listen to others or try to learn new concepts, ideas or theories from others. Extreme, out of control, obsessive, ego, lust and craving sexual desires. Extreme and out of control, ego desires and craving for speed. Extreme and out of control, ego desires and craving for fear-based social media, fear-based computer games, or fear-based media news. Craving the need for noise pollution. All childlike sulking behaviours. All childlike tit-for-tat behaviours that try to hurt or blame others simply for revenge. All childlike tit-for-tat behaviours through different why questioning. All pretentious behaviours, in other words, trying to appear more important or superior to others than you actually are. All masculine chauvinistic behaviours that try to appear more important or superior to women. Inhumane behaviours towards humans or animals, with no concerns for the welfare, kindness or compassion for others. Using humans or animals as slave labour, with no concerns for the welfare, kindness or compassion for others. Aggressive, boss-type, authoritarian slave labour behaviours, used simply to make financial profits, with no concerns for the welfare, kindness or compassion for others. Possessiveness, verbal mental cruelty or mental manipulation. Revenge through verbal aggression. Revenge through verbal threatening actions. Revenge through legal threatening actions. Fickle thoughts and behaviours. Judgmental of others. Pretentious behaviours. Intolerance. Ruthless behaviours. False accusations. Frustration behaviours. Rudeness. Unawareness of others' suffering. Oblivious to others' suffering. Disregard of others' suffering. Lack of generosity. Lack of caring. Lack of giving. Lack of loving kindness. Lack of compassion. Lack of conscience, ethics or morality. Lack of values or scruples or principles. Lack of tolerance towards others. Lack of patience towards others. Biased opinions and beliefs. Distortion of truth. Aggressive power struggles with others. Aggressive competitive power struggles with others. Betrayal. Ostracism. Superficial behaviours. Fickle behaviours. Backhanded behaviours. Counterfeit behaviours. Fake behaviours. Hypocritical behaviours. Insincere behaviours. Phony behaviours. Over-inquisitive behaviours. Liking the sound of his or her own voice. Interfering behaviours. Criticising others. Judgmental of others. Judging appearances. Grandiosity. Self-conceit. Pompousness. Impudence. Ostentation. Showiness. Belittling behaviours. Aggressive, over-ambitious behaviours. Over-controlling behaviours. Vengeful behaviours. Vicious behaviours. Malicious behaviours. Inconsiderate behaviours. Domineering behaviours. Race prejudice behaviours. Class prejudiced behaviours. Racial discrimination behaviours. Prejudice behaviours. Extreme ego persecution, hostility or ill treatment behaviours of others because of different race, religion, or political beliefs. Favoritism, discouragement, misery, moodiness, complaining, moaning, negative talk, negative thinking, boredom, pessimism, melancholia, self-pity, vying for attention, moroseness, regret, blame of self, blame of others, resentment behaviours, despondency behaviours, stubbornness behaviours, petty conflicts, petty arguments, greed, stingy, close-fisted behaviours, miserly behaviours, racism behaviours, racial discrimination behaviours, gender racism behaviours, class racism behaviours, patriarchy behaviours, chauvinist behaviours, discrimination behaviours, avenging behaviours, vengeful behaviours, animosity towards others, vulgarity behaviours, vindictive behaviours, displaying strong unreasoning desires for revenge, ruthless manipulator behaviours, defensive behaviours, deceit, trickery, deception, betrayal, dishonesty, lies, lying, cheating, snitching, sneakiness, escapism, bribery, exploitation of others, exploiting others through slave labour, fraudulent behaviours, corrupt thoughts and corrupt behaviours, bribery and corruption, corruptive plotting and scheming, corruptive stealing, copyright fraud, corruption, stealing, computer hacking, computer scams, computer phishing, surveillance, investigating others, spying on others, trickster behaviours, privacy, surveillance behaviours, heartlessness, inhumanity, inhumane behaviours, causing censorship of positive and peaceful activism, evasion behaviours, distortion of truth behaviours, fabrication of truth behaviours, forgery behaviours, slander behaviours, bossy behaviours, calculating behaviours, bully tactic behaviours, evil plotting and scheming behaviours, stalking behaviours, scamming behaviours, exploiting or degrading others' behaviours, frustration behaviours, conceited behaviours, annoyance behaviours, irritability behaviours, intolerance behaviours, underhanded behaviours, disrespect of others' behaviours, agitation behaviours, antagonism behaviours, accusation behaviours, casting assumptions behaviours, bad manners behaviours, unforgiving behaviours, superficial behaviours, insincerity behaviours, strictness, self-importance, self-opinionated behaviours, selfishness, self-centered, extreme aggressive ego-competitive power struggles given to others or received from others through many different opinions or beliefs, or ideologies such as monetary, financial, economic, political, social, cultural, religious or sports, etc. All hierarchical control from authority figures over others. Any of the above can either be given to others or received from others, but either way, any of the above will become stored into our long-term memories. Also, ego emotions given to others or received from others for many other different reasons, such as suppression, oppression, exploitation, family favoritism, family indoctrination, family rivalries, abandonment issues, orphaning issues, adoption issues, evacuation issues, loss of love, loss through death of a loved one, lack of love, too much love taken away, lack of attention, lack of loving kindness, lack of compassion, lack of empathy, lack of self-respect, lack of self-worth, lack of self-love, lack of belonging, diminished self-esteem, lack of self-confidence, intimidation, rejection, humiliation, loss of innocence, loneliness, isolation, feeling misunderstood, feeling unrecognized, self-pity. In extreme circumstances, many different childhood, unknown, involuntary, illogical, irrational, extreme, ego, fear or hurt emotions can become so extreme in adulthood that they can sometimes become the cause of many different kinds of mental health issues, such as deep depression, obsessions, addictions, extreme ego greed for money, short attention span behaviours, indoctrination behaviours, narcissistic behaviours, sadistic behaviours, sociopath behaviours, or psychopath behaviours. Please be aware, however, that this book is not a substitute for any kind of mental health medical treatment that you may be receiving from your doctor. And please also be aware that there are nearly 8 billion plus people now living on our fragile planet Earth, and therefore we are all very different from each other. Therefore, we have all developed very different ego emotions and adult ego behavioural patterns, all different and in all different degrees of strength. These few chapters that concern our childhood ego emotions and our adult ego behavioural patterns is simply the beginning of these discussions. There is still a great deal more that we still don't know about ourselves that we are going to discuss in these next few chapters. This is why we must continue throughout the first half of this book to persevere and to have the courage to get to know ourselves and what human emotions and behaviours have steered mankind in one specific direction and has ruled and controlled our lives for millions of years. Therefore, in these next few chapters, we are going to briefly explain how we have all developed some of our ancient ancestors' genetic emotions that have been passed on to us all through our genes and through each generation, inherited from many of our ancestors' emotional events, and that date back millions of years and have become stored in certain areas in our brain. We all have our ancestors' genetic emotions, including myself, but differ slightly in size depending on our gender, as you are about to discover throughout these next few chapters. We must now get to know what these highly important human emotions and behaviours are, and where they have become stored in certain areas in our brain. We must begin to understand ourselves and our human behaviours, so that in the second half of this book we can begin to discuss the practical solutions for us all to function dominantly in our long-term memories through the huge attributes of our advanced, highly evolved altruistic emotions, so that we can all begin to live through the emotions and behaviours of the collective consciousness, because this is when no human will ever know the meaning of suffering ever again.